12 specialists, 12 medical degrees from the finest Ivy League schools. 12 times Bobby P. Bellis had written a check that could buy a small island to keep his mother, Elizabeth, from slipping into the silence. And 12 times they had treated his mother like a declining stock option instead of a human being. So Bobby did what the CEO of the Bellis Group does best. He retreated behind his silver-streaked boardroom desk, turned on his 4K surveillance monitors, and watched. He watched every breath, every milliliter of morphine, and every twitch of the eyelid from a marble desk that had decided the fate of global markets. Returning to the clinical suite, Bobby found Vittoria sitting by the bed, holding Elizabeth's hand between both of hers. The elderly woman's face, usually tight with the grimace of chronic pain, was serene for the first time in months. "The agency said you were just an immigrant seeking a visa," Bobby said, standing in the shadows of the doorway. "And they said you were a titan," Vittoria replied, not breaking her gaze from his mother. "But a titan who can only look at his own mother through a glass lens isn't much of a son, is he?" The room went silent. Bobby looked at his perfectly manicured hands, then at the weathered, fragile hand of his mother resting in Vittoria's dark, steady grip. "The medical protocols stay in the drawer," Bobby commanded. "From now on, you decide the care. You don't leave this wing. I'll double your salary." "I don't need your money to be a human being, Mr. Bellis," said Vittoria, finally meeting his gaze with eyes like polished flint. "I need you to be a man. I can handle the medicine, but only you can handle the truth she's been trying to tell you." Bobby walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city skyline he practically owned. He had built his world on data and detachment, but today he realized that a spreadsheet couldn't account for a dying woman's peace. He turned back to her, the CEO's coldness replaced by a flicker of something far more frightening, a son's vulnerability. "Keep her comfortable, Vittoria. I'll handle the family secrets." The heavy glass doors of the executive suite didn't just close, they sealed with a hiss of filtered air. Bobby P. Bellis stood in the dimly lit hallway of his penthouse, the rhythmic mechanical wheezing of his mother's oxygen concentrator echoing through the high-fidelity speakers. Behind him, the 12th specialist, a man with a Harvard jacket and a trembling voice, scrambled to justify his failure. "Mr. Bellis, the vitals are within the projected margin for her age." "Get out," Bobby said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The air in the hallway seemed to turn to ice. "You spent 6 hours staring at the tablet and not once did you speak her name. You're not a doctor, you're an accountant. I have software for that." As his security team escorted the stunned man toward the private elevator, Bobby turned his gaze to the monitors lining the wall. He saw Elizabeth, pale, fragile, a life force flickering out against a world that had already moved on to the next fiscal year. Bobby's silver-streaked hair caught the blue light as he adjusted his silk tie. He could navigate a hostile takeover, but he was losing to a common hospital bed. "The next one is in the lobby, sir. Vittoria. No corporate agency backing, just a background in difficult transitions." Bobby smoothed his tailored suit and walked toward the reception area. He expected another technician who would bow their head and stammer through a list of certifications. When he pushed the doors open, he found a woman standing by the window, looking out at the sunset over the Atlantic. She didn't turn around immediately. She was dressed in a simple, deep blue uniform, her posture possessing a grounded dignity that made the expensive room look small. "You're late," she said, her voice steady and carrying the rich melodic lilt of the coast of Africa. Bobby stepped into the light, letting the shadows fall away from his sharp, silver-bearded face. He leaned against the reception desk, his presence designed to dominate. "I own the time in this building. You're Vittoria?" She turned then. She didn't flinch at his power or the cold aura of his wealth. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye with a clinical, weary compassion. It was the look of someone who had seen the end of life many times and wasn't impressed by a bank balance. "I am," she replied, walking toward him. She stopped just 2 feet away, ignoring the unspoken boundary of his status. "I've read your mother's chart. You fired 12 people because you're looking for a cure for old age. I don't deal in cures, Mr. Bellis. I deal in dignity. And the reality is, your mother is being stifled by your pride. Bobby leaned in closer, his voice a low warning rumble. You know who I am? What I can do to your career? I know you're a man who thinks he can buy a peaceful exit the way he buys a competitor, said Victoria, her chin tilting upward. I don't care about your company. I care about Elizabeth. If you want someone to bow when you walk in, hire a secretary. If you want your mother to find peace before she leaves, let me work. Bobby studied her. She was the first person in a year who hadn't looked at him like a paycheck, but rather like a hurdle. Start tonight, Bobby said. But know this, Victoria. If you neglect her for 1 second, there isn't a border in this world I won't cross to find you. Then we understand each other, she said, already turning toward the medical suite. Because if I fail her, I'll have to answer to a higher power than a CEO. The office of Bobby P. Bellis sat 40 stories above the city, a fortress of glass, steel, and unyielding silence. Outside, the world was a frantic scramble for relevance, but inside, the air was conditioned to a surgical crispness, smelling of expensive mahogany and the faint metallic tang of high-end electronics. Bobby sat behind his black marble desk, the silver streaks in his hair catching the cold luminescence of the wall-to-ceiling surveillance monitors. He didn't look like a man in mourning. He looked like a predator coordinating a global offensive. Behind him, 12 screens flickered with the steady, unblinking feed of the medical suite. He could see the micro-fluctuations of his mother's heart rate, the exact percentage of oxygen in her blood, and the silent, sterile movements of the room. This was Bobby's domain, a world where everything could be measured, managed, and bought. To him, Elizabeth wasn't just his mother, she was a legacy that needed to be preserved with the same clinical efficiency he applied to a hostile takeover. He didn't visit her, he monitored her. He believed that proximity clouded judgment, and in the high-stakes game of life and death, judgment was the only currency that mattered. His silver-streaked beard was trimmed to a precise edge, a testament to a life lived in increments of perfection. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes tracking a nurse on the screen who was adjusting a pillow. To Bobby, the nurse was merely a variable in an equation, an expendable unit of labor. He had fired 12 of them in as many months, each dismissal delivered with the same flat, emotionless tone. They were too slow, too emotional, or too human. He didn't want humanity, he wanted results. He wanted a professional who could oversee the inevitable without the messiness of empathy. As the sun began to set, casting long, jagged shadows across his desk, Bobby leaned back in his leather chair. The blue glow from the monitors reflected off his sharp features, masking the hollowness that lived beneath his expensive suit. He was the silver-streaked lion, a man who had built an empire on the ruins of his competitors. Yet here he was, watching a woman fade in 4K resolution, powerless to stop the one thing his money couldn't buy. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass, the ice clinking like a warning. He was fully in command, detached and watchful, waiting for the next variable to arrive, a woman named Victoria who had no idea she was stepping into a cage made of glass and scrutiny. The dossier on Bobby's desk was thin, a stark contrast to the heavy, leather-bound portfolios of the Ivy League specialists he had discarded like old newspapers. It contained no glowing recommendations from Manhattan clinics, no research papers, and no social pedigree. It simply stated a name, Victoria Souza Rodriguez, and a list of private care experiences in regions of the world where medicine was often a matter of grit rather than technology. To a man like Bobby, who calculated value based on the thickness of a resume, Victoria was a statistical anomaly, a desperate last resort. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his lobby, his silhouette sharp against the encroaching twilight. When the elevator dinked and Victoria stepped out, Bobby didn't turn immediately. He let the silence stretch, a calculated move to establish the hierarchy of the room.
He expected to see a woman bowed by the weight of his reputation, perhaps fidgeting with her bag or avoiding the predatory stillness of his gaze. Instead, when he finally turned, he found her standing with a quiet, centered dignity that felt like a challenge. She wore a simple, deep blue uniform that looked lived in but pristine. Her skin was the color of rich earth, and her eyes held a steady, weary intelligence that seemed to look right through his tailored armor. Bobby leaned back against a marble pillar, crossing his arms. "The agency says you have a talent for difficult transitions." His voice was a low, clinical grate. "That's a polite way of saying you're used to seeing people die when the machines stop working." "It means I know how to stay when everyone else wants to leave," Vittoria replied, her voice a melodic anchor, unfazed by his aggression. Bobby let out a short, hollow huff of a laugh. He walked toward her, stopping just close enough to be an intimidation. "I don't need a martyr, Vittoria. I need a technician who can follow the 4K feed protocols I've spent millions to install. You're here because I've run out of people with better degrees. Don't mistake my necessity for confidence." He handed her a security badge, his fingers intentionally brushing hers to see if she would flinch. She didn't. "You'll work the midnight shift," he continued, turning his back on her to return to his monitors. "There is a camera in every corner of that suite. I will be watching. I expect you to fail by Tuesday. Most people with your background usually find the scrutiny too much to handle." Vittoria took the badge, her expression unchanged. "I have lived through things more frightening than a camera, Mr. Bellis. I am here for your mother." As she walked toward the medical wing, Bobby watched her through the glass partitions. He saw an expendable variable, a woman who would surely crumble under his rigid digital eye. He returned to his desk, adjusted the brightness on his monitors, and prepared to document her first mistake. The penthouse was a vacuum of silence, save for the low electric thrum of the cooling fans behind a monitor wall. Bobby sat in the center of the darkness, his face bathed in a flickering, ethereal cyan. He had become a ghost in his own home, a silent sentry who preferred the digital ghost of his mother to the breathing woman in the other room. His eyes, red-shot and unblinking, flitted across the 12 screens like a hawk searching for a break in the tall grass. He wasn't looking for signs of his mother's recovery. He was hunting for Vittoria's first act of negligence. On the central screen, Vittoria moved with a frustrating, rhythmic grace. She didn't check the digital displays with the frantic frequency of the previous nurses. Instead, she spent an agonizing amount of time simply standing by the bed, her hand hovering near Elizabeth's shoulder as if sensing the heat of a fever before the sensors could record it. Bobby tapped a pen against his marble desk, his jaw tightening. He watched her adjust the IV drip, her movements so fluid and practiced that he couldn't find a single breach of protocol to exploit.
"Check the vitals, not the blanket," he muttered to the empty office, his voice a dry rasp. He wanted her to fail. He wanted her to be the lazy, unqualified stereotype he had constructed in his mind, because if she were competent, it meant his prejudice was the only thing that was broken. At 2 a.m., a time when the human soul is at its thinnest, Elizabeth's breathing became ragged. Bobby leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk until the wood bit into his palms. He waited for Vittoria to panic, to fumble with the emergency page, or to freeze in the face of the inevitable. Instead, he saw her lean in close. She didn't reach for the oxygen dial. She reached for Elizabeth's hand, lacing her dark fingers through the pale, translucent ones of his mother. Through the high-fidelity audio feed, a sound drifted into Bobby's office that made him freeze. It wasn't a medical alarm. It was a hum, a low, resonant vibration coming from Vittoria's throat. It was a song with no words he recognized, yet it carried the weight of centuries. On the screen, the jagged red line of Elizabeth's heart rate began to smooth out, the spikes of anxiety settling into a calm, steady rhythm. Bobby stared at the display, his finger hovering over the intercom button to reprimand her for unprofessional conduct, but his hand stayed paralyzed. For the first time in 3 years, the monitors showed something he couldn't quantify. He was the most powerful man in the city, surrounded by the best technology money could buy, yet he was watching an immigrant nurse do with a song what he couldn't do with 40% of the skyline.
He remained in the shadows, a captive of his own surveillance, watching the outsider bring a peace to the room that his millions had only ever managed to disturb. The 4 a.m. tide brought the crisis Bobby had been predicting, but not in the way his algorithms had envisioned. On the high-definition monitors, Elizabeth's chest began to heave, a shallow, desperate hitching that signaled a respiratory spike. The pulse oximeter wailed, a shrill, piercing cry that cut through the silence of Bobby's office like a siren. He stood abruptly, his hands slamming onto the desk, eyes wide as he waited for Vittoria to scramble for the crash cart or the emergency override switch. But Vittoria did not move toward the machines. In a startling breach of the no physical interference mandate Bobby had written into her contract, she lowered the guardrails of the medical bed. She bypassed the oxygen concentrator and the digital nebulizer. Instead, she sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled Elizabeth's frail, shaking frame into her arms. It was a scene of raw, forbidden intimacy that made Bobby's breath hitch in his throat. Through the surveillance lens, he saw his mother's face, not as a patient, but as a terrified woman, clutching at Vittoria's blue scrubs. Then came the sound. It wasn't the sterile beep of the monitors, but a low, guttural melody that seemed to rise from the very floorboards. Vittoria began to sing. The language was Husa, a tapestry of rhythmic clicks and deep, resonant vowels that Bobby had never heard in the boardroom. It was a lullaby from a world of red earth and vast skies, a song designed to anchor a soul that was drifting too far from the shore. "You're breaking protocol," Bobby whispered to the screen, his voice trembling. "You're supposed to increase the flow. You're supposed to call the duty doctor." He reached for the intercom to bark an order, to reassert the dominance of his technology, but his hand stayed paralyzed. For the first time in 3 years, the monitors showed something he couldn't quantify. He was the most powerful man in the city, surrounded by the best technology money could buy, yet he was watching an immigrant nurse do with a song what he couldn't do with 40% of the skyline. He remained in the shadows, a captive of his own surveillance, watching the outsider bring a peace to the room that his millions had only ever managed to disturb. The fourth-hour stillness was broken only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator, a sound that Bobby had come to associate with the steady erosion of his mother's life. On the monitor, Vittoria was no longer singing. She was kneeling on the floor, her movements quiet and deliberate, as if she were searching for something the sensors had missed. Bobby leaned closer to the screen, his sharp eyes tracking her as she reached beneath the heavy, mahogany frame of the medical bed. His brow furrowed. There was nothing supposed to be under there. He had cleared the room of clutter months ago, replacing personal mementos with state-of-the-art diagnostic tools. But Vittoria's fingers found purchase on something hidden deep in the shadows, far beyond the reach of the daily cleaning crews. With a gentle tug, she pulled out a small, battered wooden box, its surface scarred by time and coated in a fine layer of forgotten dust. Bobby's heart gave a strange, erratic thud. He recognized that box. It was a relic from his childhood, something he thought had been lost in one of the many moves that followed his father's sudden disappearance 40 years ago. On the screen, Vittoria didn't open it immediately. She sat on the floor, her dark hands resting on the lid with a reverence that felt like a prayer. She looked toward Elizabeth, who was drifting in a shallow, medicated sleep. And then, as if receiving a silent permission, she lifted the latch. The camera caught the contents in high definition, a stack of yellowed envelopes bound together by a frayed blue ribbon. Bobby's breath hitched. These weren't medical records or legal documents. They were letters, their edges curled and ink faded into the parchment. He watched as Vittoria carefully untied the ribbon, her expression shifting from curiosity to a profound, somber understanding.
"What is that?" Bobby whispered to the empty office, his voice cracking the clinical silence. He felt a sudden, violent urge to storm into the room and snatch the box away, to reassert his control over the narrative of his family. But he remained paralyzed by the sight of Vittoria's face. She picked up the top letter, her eyes scanning the slanted, elegant script of his mother's younger hand. As she read, her gaze flickered toward the monitors, almost as if she knew the silver-streaked lion was watching from his ivory tower.
She didn't look away in guilt. Instead, she tucked the letters against her chest, her jaw setting in a firm line of protection. Bobby realized with a jolt of cold realization that he was looking at 40 years of secrets, a hidden history that his surveillance had never detected. The immigrant nurse had found the one thing his millions couldn't buy, the truth of why his mother was truly fading. The office remained a tomb of cold blue light, but for the first time, Bobby felt the temperature drop for reasons that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. On the monitor, Victoria sat in the velvet armchair beside the bed, the yellowed parchment of the first letter resting in her lap. She didn't look at the IV bags or the heart rate monitor. She looked at Elizabeth, whose eyes were now open, clouded but fixed on the nurse with an expression of desperate longing. "Read it." Elizabeth's voice came through the speakers, a ghost of a whisper that made Bobby's hands tremble. Victoria began to read. Her voice, usually a melodic anchor, took on a solemn, steady weight. The letters weren't from his father, as Bobby had assumed. They were unsent drafts written by Elizabeth, dated from the summer of 1986, the year the world had told Bobby his father had simply walked out on them. As the words filled the room, the image of the silver-streaked lion in the office began to fracture. The letters detailed a different story, a mountain of debt, a failing business, and a choice Elizabeth had made. She hadn't been a victim of abandonment, she had been the architect of it. To save the family's remaining assets and Bobby's future, she had struck a deal with the creditors to send his father away, paying for his silence with the very money that had started the Bellis Group. "I traded your father for your empire, Bobby," Elizabeth whimpered on the screen, her gaze drifting toward the hidden camera lens as if she could see her son's soul through the glass. "You have spent 40 years building a wall of monitors so you would never have to see the truth," Victoria continued, her eyes never wavering from the lens. "You watch the heart rate, but you do not hear the heart. You watch the breathing, but you do not know the soul that is gasping for air. You think you are a god because you have a rec button, but you are just a man hiding in the shadows of his own success." She stood up, moving closer to the camera until her face filled the screen. Her expression wasn't an expression of anger. It was something far more painful to behold. It was disappointment. "Your mother did not keep those letters to hurt you," she whispered, her breath fogging the imaginary glass between them. "She kept them because she was waiting for the boy she raised to come back and replace the man you became. She is not dying of cancer, Bobby. She is dying of the silence you have curated so perfectly. The choice is yours. You can stay in your office and watch her take her last breath on a screen in 4K resolution, or you can be a son." She held the stare for 5 agonizing seconds, her gaze a searing indictment of his entire life. Then she turned her back to the camera and returned to Elizabeth's side. Bobby sat in the dark, his hand trembling over the marble desk, the blue light of the monitors finally feeling like the cold digital tomb it had always been.
The office had become an altar of glass, and Bobby Bellis was its primary sacrifice. He sat motionless, the amber liquid in his glass long forgotten, staring at the 12 screens that had served as his window to a world he thought he understood. The monitors hummed, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to synchronize with the throbbing in his temples. For years, he had worshipped at the feet of data and distance, believing that the blue light of surveillance was a shield against the messiness of grief. But as he watched Victoria adjust the thin blanket over his mother's knees, the shield shattered. He looked at the dark-skinned woman on the screen, the variable he had dismissed as a desperate immigrant, the technician he had expected to fail. He had hired her to be a pair of eyes when he was too afraid to use his own, yet she had seen more in 3 days than he had in 3 decades. She knew the texture of his mother's regret. She knew the melody that calmed her terrors. She knew the weight of the secret that had built the Bellis Group. He was the CEO, the owner of the building, and the man who signed the checks. But in the reality of that room, he was a ghost. Victoria was the only one who was truly alive. A violent surge of resentment flared in his chest.
followed quickly by a hollow, aching shame. He had prided himself on calm authority and controlled intelligence, yet he had used those tools to curate a high-definition lie. He looked at his clasped hands, the skin pale and expensive, and realized they had touched nothing of substance in years. He had played God with a joystick, watching life and death situations from the shadows, detached and fully in command, while the woman he deemed lesser was doing the holy work of holding a dying woman together. The irony was a bitter pill. He had built an empire to ensure he would never be powerless again, only to find himself a prisoner of his own surveillance. On the screen, Vittoria looked back at his mother with a tenderness that money couldn't buy, a warmth that made the cooling fans of his monitors sound like a funeral dirge. He wasn't the silver-streaked lion anymore. He was just a man in a sharp suit, sitting in a dark room, realizing that the nurse he had looked down upon was the only person on earth who truly knew the woman who gave him life. The glass between the office and the medical wing didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a mirror, reflecting a man who had everything, yet possessed absolutely nothing. The silence in the office was suddenly broken by the sharp mechanical click of a master switch. One by one, the 12 4K monitors flickered and died, their blue luminescence receding from Bobby's face like a retreating tide. The silver-streaked lion sat in total darkness for a long minute, his breath hitching in the hollow space where his pride used to live. For 3 years, those screens had been his heartbeat, his filter, and his fortress. Now they were just cold, black rectangles reflecting a man he no longer recognized. He stood up, his joints stiff from the hours of stagnant vigilance. He didn't check his reflection in the glass or adjust his silk tie. He walked past the mahogany desk, past the awards of a dozen hostile takeovers, and pushed open the heavy oak doors of his suite. The hallway felt miles long, the air growing warmer and more human with every step he took away from his ivory tower. When he reached the medical wing, he didn't check the digital keypad or wait for his security team to clear the path. He pushed the glass doors open with his own hands. The room was bathed in the soft, amber glow of a bedside lamp, smelling not of ozone and chemicals, but of the lavender oil Vittoria had used to soothe Elizabeth's skin. Vittoria stood by the window, her silhouette quiet and unsurprised. She didn't say a word as Bobby approached the bed. She simply stepped back into the shadows, giving him the space he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Bobby looked at his mother. Without the digital grain of a camera, she looked smaller, more fragile, and more beautiful than the monitors had ever allowed. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in 40 years, Bobby didn't look for a medical metric. He looked for her. "Bobby?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of silk. He didn't answer with a report on her vitals. He sat on the edge of the mattress, breaking the sterile protocol he had once worshipped, and reached out. His hand, once used only for signatures and handshakes, trembled as he took hers. He felt the warmth of her skin, the thrum of her pulse, and the weight of the secrets that no longer stood between them. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against her frail hand, and let the first act of genuine love in years break through his armor. He wasn't the CEO of the Bellis Group, and he wasn't the watchman of an empire. He was just a son, finally home, weeping silently as he traded his 4K vision for the clarity of a single human touch. Behind him, Vittoria watched the dragon dissolve into a man, knowing that while she had treated the body, the soul had finally begun to heal itself.